Father Michael Renninger told the story of when, as a college student, he paid a visit to his grandparents. His grandfather had experienced a series of strokes which had left him paralyzed on one side and unable to talk or swallow. But his grandmother was determined that she would take care of him at home even though he required a feeding tube. On the day of Renninger's visit, as he stepped through the doorway, he knew something was wrong. His grandfather was in the bed, and with a red face, he was gesturing with his right hand while his grandmother stood over him, frantically trying to move things around. Something had gone wrong with the feeding tube, and the liquid was everywhere. His grandfather was flustered, and his grandmother was crying. The young Renninger, embarrassed for them both, instinctively turned to quietly leave. He put his hand on the door, started to push it open, and as it squeaked, his grandmother looked up and said to him firmly, "Don't you dare. Don't you dare leave, because sometimes love looks like this." Love doesn't look away when life gets messy or difficult. And that's what I believe Jesus was trying to teach his disciples in this morning's text, which introduces us to one of his most famous miracles, the feeding of more than 5,000 people with only 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread. It's the only miracle that's recorded in all 4 of the Gospels. But we can become so taken by the scale of the miracle that we miss what I think is an important backstory leading up to the miraculous feeding. Jesus' mentor, John the Baptist, who had spent his preaching career speaking truth to power, was now dead. Because he had called out Herod for his immorality, John had been arrested and thrown into prison. And Herod's wife, who was also the target of John's fiery accusations, tricked her husband into the execution of John. John was beheaded, and in a moment of high drama, his decapitated head was presented to Herod on a platter. Given John's ongoing antagonism of Herod when he had been alive, the news of his death probably wasn't unexpected when it reached Jesus, but it left him stunned and grieving nonetheless. Even while grieving the death of his friend, Jesus was now faced with what it meant for his own ministry. And so our text opens up telling us he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But the crowds of people wouldn't leave him alone. They followed him on foot, demanding his attention. And so Jesus, looking out over the crowd, put aside his own grief for the moment, dug deep down into his soul, and found the strength to cure the sick. Because he loved them. Our text says he had compassion for them. Compassion literally means to suffer with. His love was the kind of love that suffered with the sick, the poor, and those who had been made to feel unacceptable. And it was these people in all their messiness that hunted him down on that day, demanding his unwavering attention in this deserted place. Well, as the evening began to approach, the disciples, no doubt concerned for Jesus' physical and mental well-being, tried to get him to send the crowds home. There was no denying the crowds would have been hungry. Some of them more than just hungry, but starving. "Adjourn this meeting and send the people away," the disciples told Jesus, "so they can go get something to eat." And that's when Jesus essentially told them the same thing that Renninger's grandmother had said to him. "Don't you dare. Don't you dare look away from the needs of this ragged, hungry crowd. Because sometimes love looks like this. Even when we feel as if we have nothing left within us to give, we must not turn away. Because that's what love looks like. Even when we feel like we just can't bear one more grim headline on our news feed, we must look. In the words of Mark Whitfield, we must see the images of federal law enforcement beating citizens in Portland. We must see children held in cages at the Texas-Mexico border. We must hear the stories of families ravaged by COVID-19. We must hear the stories of businesses going under because there is no business. We must listen to teachers who fear for their lives by entering their classrooms. We must feel the pain of children kept outside hospitals while their parents are dying inside. We must watch the videos of black men and women being violently assaulted and murdered by overzealous police officers. We cannot, we must not avert our eyes. And to that I add, we must not turn away from the violent murders of our trans siblings, nor can we ignore our LGBTQ youth who are 120% more likely to experience homelessness than our other youth. And we must not turn our backs on the 30% of Waco residents who are living in poverty and struggling to meet basic needs, now an even larger number because of the COVID-19 pandemic. To turn away from all the pain and suffering because it makes us sad or because we are tired is the ultimate expression of privilege. Only those of us who are safe and out of harm's way can make that sort of choice. And to do so is insensitive, arrogant, and a lot of other things, but it isn't love. Jesus said to love our neighbors as ourselves. And that means, among other things, looking at the messiness of life. It means having compassion, suffering with the ones who have begun to lose hope. And it means using our privilege to address the needs of others. One way our church has addressed the needs of others in the past was in its participation in a community walk that raises funds to fight global and local hunger. But because of the pandemic, that won't be happening this year. Or at least it won't be happening the way it has happened in the past. Instead, it will be happening virtually. Local churches and organizations are invited to collect funds virtually and maybe even provide a video of themselves walking that can be incorporated into the virtual Crop Hunger Walk presentation on November 15th. I'll be providing more details, but for now know that I will be setting up a team website for our church and inviting each of you to reach out to your friends to make online donations. A portion of the money raised will benefit Caritas of Waco, which formerly served more than 100 families per day. But because of the pandemic, it now serves more than twice that amount. The remainder of the funds raised will go to Church World Service, which does global work in the areas of hunger and poverty, displaced families who are fleeing their homes, and disaster relief. If you are listening to this sermon, live or recorded, that means you have internet service. And if that's the case, then you can ask people for donations. And when you do, you are choosing not to turn away, but instead to look into the eyes of hunger and poverty and to do something about it. You are choosing to love the way Jesus loved when he told his disciples they need not go away. You give them something to eat. Love is like that. It doesn't turn away from the suffering of others, even when it feels crippled by its own personal grief. It feeds people who are hungry, even when there seems to be no available resources at hand. Love is like a grandmother tenderly caring for her incapacitated husband, even when she's not a nurse. Love is like a grandson who doesn't turn back when he sees his parents in distress. Love is justice in action. Cornel West said, "Justice is what love looks like in public, just like tenderness is what love feels like in private." May we never turn away from the suffering of the world, but look upon it with eyes of love and compassion, which compel us to do justice and love kindness as we walk humbly with our God. Amen.